Thank you all very much indeed for coming along and waiting a bit longer than scheduled for my talk. I'll talk, if it's okay, for about 10 minutes, then we'll have a very brief time for some questions which will flash up on a screen. Some of you might have been here last January when I opened my thoughts by saying that Theresa May was someone who was interesting in spite of herself. She is a dogged but not particularly exciting Prime Minister who was a year ago operating in extraordinary circumstances. Well, a year on, she's become a lot more exciting in spite of herself. She is a Prime Minister in the most extraordinary situation. At times, again, in spite of herself, she has looked at times like James Bond or taking part in a James Bond thriller, flying through the night in the middle of December last year to sign the so-called phase one of the Brexit deal, calling an early election, which is the context of the drama that's going to be played out over the next 12 months. That election had a kind of Shakespearean impact. In Shakespeare's plays, if the natural order is disturbed, forces are unleashed against the person who instigated the breaking up of the natural order. Macbeth, King Lear. And now add Theresa May, who called an early election, breaking up the natural order of things in order to win a much bigger majority, and the forces she unleashed were turned against her, and she's now trying to navigate Brexit with this hung parliament. A year ago, as we were all gathered in this room, I argued that she was then, as a Prime Minister, as powerful in some respects as Margaret Thatcher in the late 80s. She is now one of the weakest Prime Ministers since 1945, having lost that election. And although when she flew through the night in December like James Bond to sign phase one of the Brexit deal, was a moment of relief for her and in some respects a triumph for dogged persistence, it merely papered over the cracks. That phase one agreement reminds me very precisely with Tony Blair's attempt to get UN resolutions before the war in Iraq. For those of you old enough to remember that drama, Blair secured one UN resolution, UN 1441, and he came back and said, right, we're on our way now with the UN. But that resolution said nothing. It papered over all cracks. Anyone in the world could sign it. It basically said Iraq was somewhere in the Middle East, and everyone agreed. And he could not get that second resolution, if you remember, because then you were down to what you meant by words, and he couldn't get the agreement. And that phase one had words that most of us don't use very often. Alignment is a word that I now use all the time, and it meant different things to different people. To Ireland, it meant one thing. To Boris Johnson and Liam Fox, who you heard from at the beginning, it meant something wholly different. And now we begin to get to the precision. So I am of the view, some people think that phase one went so by the end smoothly after many, many dramas, that phase two is going to be relatively straightforward. I don't think it can be or will be. She, Theresa May, is navigating through so many hurdles. She will have to be the greatest political athlete since Churchill, who was not an athlete but a metaphorical one, to pull it off. Here are some of them. The crack that was most papered over in the drama of last December was Ireland and the border. It's still not clear to me how that circle is squared. And this is, in a way, one of the more vividly accessible conundrums in this Brexit drama. In Ireland, I'm told it's true, not sort of symbolic, there is a farmer with one half of his farm in Northern Ireland and one half in Southern Ireland, which means in March 2019, half his cows will be in the European Union and the other half will have just withdrawn, causing huge problems unless there is a soft border. But you only get a soft border, I think, if you stay in the customs union, and she is pledged to leave the customs union. She talked in one of her big speeches about being an associate member of the customs union. Well, I'm an associate member of a local tennis club, and the only rule that seems to apply is that I never qualify to play any tennis. I can't get in. It's a vague term. Everything is held together by vague terms. And how you square some of your hopes, some of your support for the single market, with the commitment to leave the single market, yet to have tariff-free access, is again not at all clear. And the clock ticks. There will have to be a vote in Parliament this autumn. It can't carry on any longer than that. And it is far from clear that the deal can be done in that time. Even if that deal is done, it is also far from clear that Theresa May can even square her cabinet. As Stephen said at the beginning, you've got Liam Fox on one side, who says, incidentally, with some legitimacy, that if he is to negotiate trade deals, we have to be out of the single market and the customs union. He's not allowed to do them until we are. But on the other side, you've got Philip Hammond, who's turned into an unlikely rebel. Cuba has Che Guevara, Britain has Philip Hammond. Teenagers have posters of Philip Hammond on their walls, who wants relatively close alignment with the European Union, but is far from clear how he's going to achieve it. Then you have the Labour Party in this incredibly multi-layered game, very serious game. You heard Chuka earlier putting the case for full membership of the single market, full membership of the customs union, and hoping for a referendum. His leader, Jeremy Corbyn, has spent much of his life opposing the European Union and is still deeply ambiguous. But I'm now moving on to predictions, a hazardous game. I sense that it is hugely in Jeremy Corbyn's interests to move towards the softest of soft Brexits. I am as certain as I can be that Labour, united almost, will vote against the deal that Theresa May brings back, which raises one of the big seismic questions in the coming year. What happens if the deal is defeated in the House of Commons? Here we are in titanic politics. Theresa May, I think, would have to go almost immediately. And that is the only circumstance in which there may be an election or a referendum. I can't see any other circumstance in which Conservative MPs vote for an election. Even then, they might not. Or Parliament can legitimately have a referendum. I think any other circumstance, a second referendum will not happen and cannot. But if the deal is defeated, we are in that cliched phrase, uncharted territory. What else is going to happen? The European Union are pretty clear about their position. If Britain wants full access to the single market, they will have to stick with the 4 freedoms, including freedom of movement. Britain cannot sign up to that, and that's not just Theresa May. That's quite a significant section of the Labour Party. I had a long session with the chair of the Business Committee, Rachel Reeves, yesterday, someone who some of you will liaise with. She, because of her Leeds constituency voting for Brexit, is passionately opposed to continued freedom of movement. So she, at the moment, is not in favour of that continuing. So it's going to be complicated. I think Theresa May will stay. If you read the newspapers today, there is beginning to be really intense speculation that Tory MPs are going to move against her. There is a huge amount of discontent with her and the lack of direction in the government within the Tory party. But as often happens with prime ministers, the lack of an alternative, the fear of the seismic disruption, I think, will keep her in place. Now, I've run out of time. I could carry on for hours. But we now need just a couple of questions. Is that right? So will they flash up on a screen somewhere? Or shall I carry on talking for 2 more minutes?
I'd say, Steve, I think you've done such a fantastic summary of the situation as we currently stand. I think the drama of the way you've left that point is absolutely perfect. Let's have one question, okay. The one on the screen there.
It's a great question. How do we stop this madness? Well, I think we need another 2 hours, and I haven't got it. There is a sense, it's really interesting, very briefly. Historians looking back at the First World War are fascinated by how it was that all the leaders knew that they were walking towards this cliff and continued walking towards it. And there is a sense, I mean, one of the other bizarre things is half that cabinet were Remainers. Theresa May, I think, genuinely was a Remainer. So she is knowingly leading the UK in a direction that she didn't want. However, it is hard for her when you've had a referendum. For politicians in the current climate to defy the popular will is impossible. So the only way this can be stopped is if public opinion changes. That would give them permission to move away from the cliff's edge. And public opinion would have to change very, very fast. It's not impossible, but unlikely that by the autumn, when what I think will be a pretty puny deal, which will worry people in this hall and elsewhere, when those details surface, the mood could change. But politicians cannot be seen to instigate it, because dangerously in Britain, there is this elite versus the rest juxtaposition. And while that's in place, this has to be led by the rest. I'm here every month doing a one-man show for hours. So this is a mere scratching of the surface, but thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Steve.